All right, you guys, welcome back to another episode here on the Sweet Life Entrepreneur and Business Podcast. I am joined again by my very favorite person this year, Francesca Witzburg. She is here diving in with everything legal for you to protect your content, your intellectual property. And this is actually part two of a two-part podcast episode we did last week. We dove all into trademarking. So if you missed last week, pause this, go back to episode 221 and start with that one, and then come back here and join us. If you listened last week, let's get ready to go. We have so much to cover today, and you're going to gain so much knowledge by this wonderful woman who is here just strictly to pour into you to protect your intellectual property. So welcome back to the show, Francesca. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, April. I'm excited to talk about copyrights.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, let's go ahead and dive right in. So really, what is copywriting for anybody who is absolutely brand new at this? They know they need to know what it is, but they don't even have a baseline starting point.
Yeah, of course. So copyright is a form of intellectual property protection that protects creative works. That can be your videos, your photos, your courses, the layout of your website, your podcasts. It covers anything that you've created that's fixed in a tangible medium. So it can't be like an idea in your head. It's got to be written down. It's got to be actually like manifested in a real medium. But once it's out there, it's protected automatically under copyright law.
Okay, so let's take a step back. I know we talked about it extensively in last week's episode, but can you just give a general description to our listeners in what is intellectual property?
Of course. Intellectual property, which is IP, which we refer to as IP, refers to creations of the mind. They're your inventions, anything that's proprietary that you came up with, your photos, your brands, your slogans, trade secrets. These are all things that you have created that either you or your business owns. And so I like to say you have your IP toolbox, and then in that toolbox, there's different tools you can use, like patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secret.
So good. Okay. So incredibly foundational, but yet so many businesses aren't aware of that. All right. So my next question for you, and I know our listeners, especially those who listened last week, are automatically asking this question right now. What is the difference between a copyright protection and trademarking?
Yes. So trademarks really protect source identifiers. So Sweet Life, when you read that name, you know that that's April Beach's programs. She's offering her consulting services. April, you've created a whole brand around that. And also it's your company name too, but to consumers, we know that that's April. So that word tells people that if you get consulting from this person, it's April who's behind it. It's the same thing when you see Coca-Cola or Burger King. You go to a McDonald's in Spain, you're gonna know that it's the same person who's behind that. That's the function of a trademark. Now, a copyright is a very different tool, but they can overlap. So copyright extends to any creative expressions. So if you have a really unique logo that went along with Sweet Life, say it's like a little like circle with some interesting artwork in there that you use, and when anyone sees that, they think April. But also, it's very detailed, it's original. That can also be protected by copyright. So if you are working with IP counsel, a good lawyer is going to advise you holistically and really tell you all the tools that you can use to protect your intellectual property from different angles.
Okay, fascinating. And so for our listeners, do they need to register their works for copyright protection?
So copyrights are similar to trademarks in that they are granted automatically. As soon as you create something, you post it online, you put it, like we said, in a fixed tangible medium, then you have protection. However, if someone is using your work in an unauthorized manner without your permission, right? To actually get them to stop in the United States, you need a registration certificate. So I like to say you could send them a letter, you can send them a DM telling them to take it down because it's using your copyrighted material, but with that, without a registration, it's like waving an empty gun. You're really not going to have any teeth behind it.
Got it. Okay. And so let's kind of just pause here, because I want to get back into content around courses and in really big written works that many of our listeners do. But let's just kind of take a jog for a second and talk about a couple of areas where people tend to run into trouble and they have absolutely no idea when they're using other people's works. So the first one is photography and using somebody else's photography within your business. What do people need to know and really in relation to copyright?
Anytime you use photos taken from the internet or anyone else's photos, technically you need permission. And you can get yourself into a lot of trouble if you use it even on just a random post, or if you're using it for something more visible. You can get into a lot of trouble. And so the way that you get around it is you either can use photos and images that you've taken yourself, or you can purchase the rights to some of these images. That's where you can use databases like Getty Images to buy a license to use those images for certain purposes.
Yeah, and I think that so many new businesses, and actually even established businesses that are just trying to scale online, just kind of starting to get their Instagram out there, they don't realize that grabbing another photo out there, that there is a license behind that, and that you have to be within your legal rights to use that. And so, just wanted to make sure we were discussing that here on the show as well, because I know that people have ran into problems with that in the past. Another kind of side question for you here, going back to our listeners' original piece of work, their course that they're creating, the content that they're delivering within their coaching programs or their mastermind, or their teaching, their intellectual property, their methods, their signature programs, right? Some of our listeners hire other people to create parts of their work for them. What do they need to know and be careful about when they're doing that?
Yeah, that's a great point, April. So when you hire someone to create, whether it's a logo, design, web design, then anytime you're paying someone to build software, whatever it is, if they're not an employee within the scope of employment, meaning paying them a salary or hourly, or they're getting benefits, then technically they are the owner of the intellectual property. So you need a written assignment. It's called an assignment, but what an assignment means is a transfer of rights. So that person needs to sign a document that says that all the intellectual property created around this program, and it's going to be more detailed than that, but I give that all that copyright and all that intellectual property is transferred to you and your company. It's very critical, especially if you're going to pay a lot of money. You really need to get this in writing, because otherwise they own what you thought you paid for, and they can continue to use themselves, or they can give it away to other people and competitors.
Yeah, imagine that nightmare, hiring somebody to, create something for you in your course or your program, and then it's not actually yours. So important. So thank you so much for discussing that. And that assignment is really incredibly important. And, I know that the majority of our listeners, their teams that they have are actually independent contractors. So this is completely something that is critical for them to be aware of. It is this assignment within their independent contractor agreements. And that's why working with an expert like you to make sure says exactly what it needs to say is so incredibly important. Okay, so let's go back to this process of protecting copyright. So another side question for you: when our listeners are using the notation on the bottom of their slides or their PDFs they're delivering or their written work, and they have the little copyright protection, and then they have the year on there, and then their ownership, why is that important? And what is the correct way, if there is a correct way, just to enter into that sort of use?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. You see the copyright symbol, which is a little C. You can do it in an emoji if you're on your phone. And then you put either your name or your company's name. whoever's really claiming rights to that IP, and then the year. And what that does, April, is that's putting third parties on notice. It's again reminding people, hey, this is my copyright. This is protectable information. If you use it without my authorization, it's illegal. So don't do it.
Got
Then
it.
people do it. The only way that you can really get them to stop is if you file that registration.
Got it. Okay. And so I know that we get that question all the time. Clearly, I don't answer it because I'm not an attorney. And I know that so many of our users are wondering that, they see that, when can I use it? How do I use it? Especially those that have multiple years listed on that listing, and exactly how to go about doing that. And so does the year usually reflect the original work, or does the year cover when it is currently being protected in that listing on those?
Yeah, it could vary, right? So like sometimes if you will open up a book, you'll see the original publication copyright notice, but then there'll be the most current version. But for our purposes, I think it's fine to do it. Like let's say you created your website in 2020. You can have 2020 as the date, but then if you make changes to it, which you're going to, you just keep updating the year. I think
okay. Okay, so many, I already know that these are questions people listening are having. Okay, so now let's go back to kind of the center of what we're talking about here today. For our listeners, how do they start the process of protecting their intellectual property, their content, course, program, outlines? Where do they begin with this process?
Yeah, I love the way you put it, April, because you implicitly said, how do they protect what they already have? Everyone already has IP. It's just a matter of understanding which are your most important assets and how we can go about protecting them. So I actually offer an IP audit where I will look at your websites, social media pages, courses. Some of my clients will give me access to their subscription based or whatever login to see their courses. I do a very holistic review, and then we'll get on the phone and do a 30-minute call to discuss what their most important assets are. And we can talk about, okay, here's the name you're operating under. Have you thought about trademarking that? Let's get a filing for that. Copyrights. Do you have your independent contractor agreement language? We'll kind of go through and just do like a checklist, like as if I literally am doing an audit on your IP to make sure you have everything there. And I recommend that as a starting point. And there's also an IP audit and an IP action plan, which is like the deluxe version of that, which is going to really do a deep dive. And then we come up with a phase 1 plan, which is your first 3 to 6 months on what filings to do. And then also the next like 6 to 12 plus months for the next round of filings. Because everyone has so much great content and such great IP, it gets a little overwhelming to think, oh, I have to do everything. And the reality is that you don't. If you stage it out and if you have a planned strategy about it, it's really not going to be that expensive. It'll be way more expensive in the end if you don't do this, and if you try to deal with cease and desist letters or sending cease and desist letters as they arise.
Yeah, nightmare. And so once somebody submits their work for copyright protection, each time they update it, do they need to resubmit that work?
It's a great question. So anytime you modify a work, then it becomes a new copyright. It's a new work. So as long as the original piece is I would say as long as the modification is substantially similar to the original work, then you can rely on that. But if it's very different and you really are using that a lot publicly, it's probably worth at least running it by an IP lawyer to come up with a strategy.
Oh man. Okay. So much great information, Francesca. Thank you so much for being our guest again here on the show and joining us in Clubhouse rooms where we talk about this. There's so many places where people can connect with you. We highly recommend that people take up the opportunity to go through an IP audit. In what I love about why I have you on this show is that you understand the way service-based online entrepreneurs work, and you understand what they're creating. You understand courses and masterminds and signature programs, and you understand all these things. And so it's hard, frankly, to find an expert like you that fully understands the assets that our listeners are creating. So thank you so much for being on the show and being an amazing resource. And the best place for people to connect with you is through your Instagram. Is that correct?
Yes, I have a link in my bio. It's my Calendly. I'm happy to get on a 15-minute call just to hear about your business and to discuss if you want to do an IP audit, or if you just want to connect and learn a little more.
Yeah, great. All of you guys should take her up on that.
It's
it's free. I know, it's crazy. It's totally free. So you can be found at the Trademark Attorney on Instagram, and we will make sure that a link to that, of course, is in our show notes as well. So it's the Trademark Attorney on Instagram. And what is your Clubhouse handle?
The Trademark Attorney.
At the Trademark Attorney on Clubhouse as well, of course. Thank you so much for being here again and being our guest expert this week. I know that everybody really needed to hear what the things we've been talking about the last 2 weeks on the show. So we certainly appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thanks, April. Thanks, everyone.